The Boeing 737 shuddered through turbulence at 37,000 feet, somewhere over the dark expanse of the Pacific. Most passengers slept or pretended to, their heads pressed against cold windows or tilted back in uncomfortable angles. In Seat 8A, Major Kestrel Vance hadn't moved in 3 hours. Her eyes were closed, but sleep was a stranger she'd stopped chasing years ago. The darkness behind her eyelids held too many memories: the glint of a missile lock, the static of a final transmission, the way fire looked at Mach 2. She wore civilian clothes now, a faded Stanford sweatshirt and jeans that didn't quite fit the woman who'd once commanded an F-15E Strike Eagle over hostile territory. Her short-cropped black hair was growing out, an awkward length that made her feel neither military nor civilian, just suspended between identities. The intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison speaking." His voice carried an edge that made Kestrel's eyes snap open. Years of training recognized that tone, controlled panic, the kind that came when protocols stopped working and instinct took over. "I need to ask if there are any military pilots currently on board this aircraft. If so, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately." The cabin stirred. Passengers exchanged glances, nervous laughter rippling through the aisles. Kestrel remained perfectly still, her fingers gripping the armrest. She counted her breaths. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The same rhythm that had kept her steady when her wingman went down over the Strait of Hormuz, when she'd had to choose between the mission and the man. She'd chosen the mission. They'd given her a medal. She'd given them her resignation 6 months later. A flight attendant moved past, her practiced smile failing to hide the fear in her eyes. Kestrel looked away, focusing on the window where only darkness lived. She was done. 3 tour, 14 years of service, 273 combat missions. She'd paid her dues in blood and sleepless nights and the weight of decisions no one should have to make. Whatever was happening in that cockpit, it wasn't her problem anymore. But the intercom crackled again. "I repeat, this is an urgent request. We need an experienced military pilot. Anyone with tactical flight experience, please make yourself known." The desperation in Captain Morrison's voice cut through her defenses like flak through aluminum. Kestrel closed her eyes again, but this time she wasn't retreating into darkness. She was calculating: fuel load, passenger count, altitude, airspeed. Her mind moved through checklists she'd memorized a lifetime ago, each one as familiar as her own heartbeat. Her hand rose slowly, almost against her will. The flight attendant saw it, relief flooding her features. "You're military," she whispered. "I was," Kestrel said, already unbuckling her seatbelt. "Take me to the cockpit." The cockpit door opened to reveal controlled chaos. Captain Morrison, silver-haired and sweating despite the cool cabin temperature, glanced back at her entrance. His co-pilot, younger and visibly shaking, kept both hands locked on the yoke. The instrument panel blazed with warning lights, a constellation of red and amber that told a story Kestrel read in seconds. Hydraulic failure. Primary flight systems compromised. They were flying on backups that wouldn't last. "You're the pilot." Morrison's voice carried doubt wrapped in desperation. He'd been expecting someone different, someone male, someone in uniform, someone who looked like the hero he needed. Major Kestrel Vance, United States Air Force, retired. She moved into the cramped space with practiced efficiency, her eyes scanning instruments. "What happened?" "Lightning strike 20 minutes ago. We thought we were clear, but it must have damaged something critical. We're losing hydraulics and the fly-by-wire system is compromised. We can maintain altitude, but landing." He trailed off, the unspoken conclusion hanging in the air like smoke. Kestrel leaned between the seats, studying the displays. The 737 systems were failing in a cascade, each malfunction triggering another. Without full hydraulics, they'd have minimal control over the flaps and landing gear. The fly-by-wire degradation meant their control inputs would be delayed, imprecise, like trying to thread a needle while wearing winter gloves. "Where are we routing?" "Guam. It's the closest suitable runway, but we're still 90 minutes out." "Not Tokyo Narita." Morrison shook his head. Weather's closed it down. Typhoon's sitting right over Honshu. Guam's our only option. Kestrel processed this, her mind already running scenarios. 90 minutes, deteriorating systems, night approach. The mathematics of survival were never kind. Have you declared an emergency? 10 minutes ago. Guam Tower's been notified. They're clearing the runway, standing by fire crews. The co-pilot spoke for the first time, his voice thin. Ma'am, with respect, have you ever flown a 737? Kestrel looked at him, seeing herself 10 years ago, young, scared, uncertain. No, she said simply. But I've landed an F-15 with one engine and no hydraulics in a sandstorm. Physics doesn't care what you're flying, only whether you understand it. Morrison exhaled slowly. What do you need from us? Everything you know about this aircraft. Every quirk, every backup system, every trick you've learned. She settled into the jump seat behind them, her eyes never leaving the instruments. And Captain, I need you to trust me when I tell you to do things that are going to feel very wrong. The Pacific stretched endlessly below them, black and indifferent. Somewhere in that darkness was an island, a runway, and a chance. Kestrel's hands were steady as she pulled out her phone, switching it to airplane mode before opening the Photos app. There, buried among images she rarely looked at, was a picture of her old squadron. 13 faces, most of them gone now. Her wingman, Lieutenant Marcus Shaw, stood at her right shoulder, smiling. He'd trusted her completely, right up until the moment his aircraft disintegrated in a fireball over the Persian Gulf. She closed the phone. The past was a luxury she couldn't afford. Talk me through your control inputs, she said to Morrison. Show me exactly what happens when you move the yoke. I need to feel how this bird flies when she's hurt. Morrison complied, making small adjustments. The aircraft responded sluggishly, a fraction of a second behind each command. Kestrel watched the control surfaces through the external cameras, noting the delayed movement of the ailerons, the sluggish elevator response. They were flying a dying machine, and they had 90 minutes to figure out how to catch it before it fell from the sky. The radio crackled. Pacific 732, Guam approach control. We have you on radar. Understand you're declaring emergency, hydraulic failure, requesting priority handling. Confirm souls on board. Morrison keyed the mic. Guam approach, Pacific 732. Affirmative on emergency. 183 souls on board, 5 crew. Request longest available runway and maximum emergency response. Copy 732. Runway 6 right is yours, 11,000 feet. Wind 080 at 12 knots, gusting to 18. Visibility 10 miles, scattered clouds at 3,000. Emergency equipment is positioning now. Advise when ready for vectors. Kestrel interrupted quietly. Ask about the approach lighting. I need to know if the entire system is operational. Morrison glanced at her, then keyed the mic. Guam approach 732. Request confirmation on runway lighting status. Need full ALSFI if available. 732, affirmative. Full approach lighting system is operational and will be set to maximum intensity. We're rolling everything we have for you. They're good people down there, Morrison said, releasing the mic. They'll do everything possible. But everything possible might not be enough, Kestrel finished for him. She didn't believe in false comfort. Hope without realism killed people. The co-pilot, whose name tag read Bennett, finally steadied his voice enough to ask the question hanging in the cockpit. What's our actual chance here, Major? Kestrel considered lying, considered offering the same practiced reassurance she'd given young pilots before dangerous missions. But these men deserve truth. Depends on how much control authority we have left by the time we reach Guam. Right now, maybe 60-40 in our favor. And if we lose more hydraulics, then we pray backup systems hold and I earn whatever they paid me all those years. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Captain Morrison, I need to understand something. When was the last time you performed a no-flap landing? Training simulator, maybe 5 years ago. And in actual aircraft? Never. Kestrel nodded slowly, processing this information against the growing list of malfunctions displayed across the instrument panel. The amber lights were multiplying, a slow-motion disaster written in electronic warnings. In 75 minutes, they would attempt something Morrison had only done in the safety of a simulator, in an aircraft that was dying by degrees, at night, with 183 people trusting that their training and experience would be enough. She thought about her old call sign, Graveyard, and how she'd earned it, not through recklessness but through bringing dead aircraft home when everyone else had written them off, through landing on fumes, through flying on backup systems, through understanding that sometimes survival was just controlled falling with style. "We're going to make this work," she said, and almost believed it herself. The next hour passed in careful preparation. Kestrel had Morrison and Bennett walk her through every system, every backup, every contingency the 737 carried in its digital brain. She learned the aircraft's language, the way it communicated through subtle vibrations, through the feel of the yoke, through the million small signals that separated a machine from a partner in survival. Commercial aircraft were different from fighters, she discovered. They were heavier, more forgiving in some ways, less responsive in others. They didn't dance through the sky, they powered through it with patient determination. But the principles remained constant. Lift versus weight, thrust versus drag, the eternal balance that kept metal and fuel and human hope suspended above the earth. Kestrel had spent 14 years mastering those principles in machines designed for violence. Now she would apply them to a machine designed for commerce and pray the translation held. Pacific 732, Guam approach. We show you approximately 60 miles northeast. Descend and maintain 10,000. Expect vectors for visual approach runway 6 right. Morrison acknowledged, then began the descent. The aircraft groaned as it pitched forward, hydraulic pumps whining under strain. More warning lights flickered to life. Kestrel watched the control surfaces through the camera displays, noting how the spoilers barely responded, how the elevators moved in short, jerking motions rather than smooth arcs. "We're degrading faster," Bennett observed, his voice tight. "Expected," Kestrel said calmly. "Hydraulic fluid is probably leaking. The more we ask of the system, the more we lose, which means we get one shot at the runway. There won't be a go-around if we miss the approach." Morrison's jaw tightened. "One shot." "One shot," Kestrel confirmed. "So we make it count. Bennett, I need you to calculate our landing speed. Factor in potential flap failure, increased approach speed, runway length. Give me numbers." Bennett's fingers flew across the flight management system. "If we can't extend flaps, we're looking at 190 to 200 knots touchdown speed. Normal is around 140. That's a huge difference." "Which means longer stopping distance," Kestrel said, thinking aloud. 11,000 feet of runway. Figure half for rollout at high speed. Tight but manageable if everything else cooperates." "And if it doesn't?" Morrison asked. Kestrel met his eyes. "Then we get creative." The island of Guam emerged from the darkness ahead, a scatter of lights against the infinite black of the Pacific. From 30,000 feet, it looked impossibly small, a temporary interruption of the ocean that surrounded it. Somewhere down there, emergency crews were assembling, firefighters checking equipment, medical teams preparing for casualties they hoped wouldn't materialize. Kestrel had seen the aftermath of aircraft disasters. She'd walked through debris fields where metal and human remains became indistinguishable. She carried images that would never leave her, ghosts that visited her in the spaces between sleep and waking. Not tonight, not on her watch. Pacific 732, turn left heading 270, descend and maintain 5,000. The aircraft rolled into the turn, but the response was delayed, imprecise. Morrison compensated, adding rudder, fighting the machine to maintain coordination. Sweat darkened his collar despite the cool cockpit. Beside him, Bennett's hands hovered over the controls, ready to assist but uncertain what help he could provide. Kestrel leaned forward. "Captain, when we're on final approach, I need you to disconnect the autopilot completely. We're going to fly this by hand." "In our current state, that's necessary," Kestrel interrupted. "The autopilot is designed for normal operations. It can't adapt fast enough to our degraded condition. But you can. Your hands will feel what the computer can't understand. Trust your instincts over the automation." Morrison nodded slowly. It went against every modern training protocol, but deep in his pilot's soul, he knew she was right. Flying was ultimately about feel, about the conversation between human and machine conducted through stick and throttle, and the subtle language of aerodynamics. 732, you're clear to descend to 3000. Contact tower on 118.7. Tower, Pacific 732 with you. Emergency aircraft approaching from the northeast. We have the field in sight. 732 Guam Tower. Welcome. Runway 6 right is yours. Winds 070 at 15 gusting to 22. All emergency equipment is standing by. Advise your intentions. Morrison glanced at Kestrel. She keyed her own headset into the system. Tower 732. Be advised we have an Air Force pilot assisting. Major Vance is coordinating our approach. We're planning straight-in, high-speed landing due to potential flap failure. Request emergency equipment positioned at runway midpoint and far end. There was a pause. Then, copy Major. Equipment will reposition. We're clearing all other traffic. The sky is yours. The finality of those words settled over the cockpit. No second chances. No alternatives. Just 11,000 feet of concrete and the question of whether their skill would prove sufficient against cascading mechanical failure. Kestrel pulled a notepad from her pocket, an old habit from her fighter days, when she'd sketch approach patterns and attack vectors by hand, finding clarity in simple diagrams. She drew the runway, marking distances, calculating angles. At 200 knots, they'd cover 11,000 feet in roughly 37 seconds. 37 seconds to bleed off speed, to keep the aircraft straight, to prevent the nose from digging in or the wings from dropping. 37 seconds that would determine whether everyone on this aircraft saw tomorrow. "Begin your final descent," she said quietly. "Gear down now while we still have hydraulic pressure." Morrison reached for the gear lever, hesitated. "If we can't retract them, we're landing one way or another. Wheels down is better than wheels up, regardless of what happens next." The gear extended with a series of heavy clunks, 3 green lights confirming locked position. But the hydraulic pressure gauge dropped noticeably, precious fluid bleeding away into damaged systems. They were committed now, riding a wounded bird toward an island in the dark, hopping that steel and aluminum and human would prove stronger than physics and probability. The lights of Guam grew larger. The runway materialized as 2 parallel lines of brilliant white, stretching toward them like a path through darkness. Kestrel's breathing slowed, her focus narrowing to this single moment. Everything else fell away, the passengers behind them, the ocean below, the memories that haunted her. There was only the aircraft, the runway, and the space between them that needed to be crossed. 5 miles final, Bennett called out, his voice steadier now. Altitude 2000, speed 190, sync rate 600. Throttle back slightly, Kestrel instructed. Let her settle into the descent, don't fight it. Morrison eased the throttles and the aircraft responded with a subtle pitch change. The sync rate increased, 700, 800 feet per minute. The runway grew larger, its lights sharp against the black earth. 3 miles, 1,500 feet, speed 185. Try the flaps, Kestrel said. Give me 5 degrees, see what happens. Morrison reached for the flap lever, moved it carefully to the first position. Hydraulic motors whined, protested. The flap position indicator flickered, showing asymmetric extension, the left wing cooperating, the right wing sluggish. "Negative," Kestrel said sharply. "Retract. Asymmetric flaps will roll us into the ground." The flaps came back up, the aircraft shuddering. So that option was gone. They would land fast and hot, hopping brakes and reverse thrust would be enough. 2 miles, 1,000 feet, speed 190. The runway filled the windscreen now, its lights blazing with artificial daylight. Kestrel could see the emergency vehicles positioned alongside, red and white strobes painting the darkness. Dozens of people down there, watching, waiting, praying for strangers they would never meet. "Disconnect autopilot," Kestrel said. "Your aircraft captain." Morrison's hands closed around the yoke. The autopilot disconnected with a soft chirp, and suddenly they were flying purely on human skill. On the thousands of hours Morrison had spent learning this aircraft's personality, on Kestrel's combat-honed instincts translating across platforms. The aircraft felt different immediately, more alive, more responsive, but also more dangerous. Every input mattered now. Every correction could save them or doom them. 1 mile, 500 feet, speed 195. "Too fast," Kestrel said. "Power back more, let gravity do the work." "If we sink too fast." "Trust me." Morrison pulled the throttles to idle. The aircraft's nose dropped, sink rate jumping to 1,200 feet per minute. The runway rushed up to meet them, concrete and lights and the promise of solid ground. The stall warning chirped softly, not critical yet but reminding them they were dancing on the edge of the envelope. 400 feet, speed 190, sink rate 1,000. Bennett's voice carried the measured calm of a man who had accepted whatever came next. Kestrel admired that. Acceptance without surrender. 200 feet, speed 185. The runway threshold passed beneath them, chevrons and lights and the beginning of concrete. Morrison pulled back gently on the yoke, trying to arrest their descent to flare for landing. The aircraft responded with agonizing slowness, hydraulics screaming, control surfaces barely moving. "Hold it," Kestrel breathed. "Hold it, let her settle." The main wheels touched first, slamming into concrete with a shuddering impact that rattled through the entire airframe. Morrison fought to keep the nose up, but without hydraulic authority, the nose gear dropped hard, compressing its struts to the limit. They were down, on the runway, still moving at nearly 200 knots. "Reverse thrust maximum." Morrison pulled the thrust reversers, and the engine note changed to a howling roar. Deceleration pressed them forward in their seats, but they were still accelerating, or rather, not decelerating fast enough. The runway's end approached with terrible speed, a black wall beyond the reach of the lights. "Brakes," Kestrel commanded. "Everything you have." Morrison stood on the brake pedals. The anti-skid system chattered, fighting to prevent the wheels from locking. The aircraft slewed slightly left, Morrison correcting with rudder that barely responded. 6,000 feet of runway behind them. 5,000. 4,000. "We're not slowing fast enough," Bennett said, his voice finally breaking. Kestrel's mind raced through options. They could veer off the runway, try to scrub speed in the grass, but at this velocity they'd likely cartwheel, break apart. They could. The aircraft shuddered as something in the brake system failed. Morrison felt it instantly, pedal resistance dropping away on the left side. They were losing brakes on one main gear. "Right brake only," Kestrel ordered. "Differential braking. Use engine thrust to counter the yaw." Morrison adjusted, pressing only the right pedal, adding left engine thrust to keep them straight. It was a delicate balance, speed and directional control and the physics of friction all competing. 3,000 feet remaining. 2,000. The end of the runway loomed, large, emergency vehicles tracking alongside, matching their speed. 1,000 feet. The aircraft shuddered again, more systems failing. The nose gear steering went dead, then came back, then failed again. Morrison was flying the aircraft with brake pressure and thrust differentials, with prayer and muscle memory and the last dregs of hydraulic fluid bleeding through dying systems. 500 feet. They were still moving at 60 knots. Too fast. The runway end barrier appeared in the landing lights, a gentle upslope designed to catch overshooting aircraft in a bed of crushable material. It would destroy the nose gear, probably tear apart the forward fuselage, but it would stop them. "Brace," Morrison shouted into the cabin intercom. But then, impossibly, the aircraft shuddered one final time and the wheels locked completely. Rubber burned against concrete in twin trails of smoke. Metal screamed. The deceleration was brutal, pressing them against their harnesses. The aircraft skidded, slewed right, then straightened. And stopped. 200 feet from the runway end. 200 feet from disaster. They sat in sudden silence, engines spooling down, emergency lights flashing through the windscreen in red and white and amber. Morrison's hands remained locked on the yoke, his knuckles white. Bennett had his eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer or thanks or simple disbelief. Kestrel exhaled slowly, her heart rate already dropping back toward normal. Controlled breathing, emotional regulation, the skills that had kept her functional through 100 near-death experiences. "Tower," she said into the radio, her voice steady, "Pacific 732 is stopped on the runway. No fire. Will begin emergency evacuation." "Copy 732. Emergency personnel are approaching. Outstanding job, outstanding." Morrison finally released the yoke, turned to look at her. His eyes were wet. "You saved us. You saved everyone." "We saved everyone," Kestrel corrected. "You flew a dead aircraft onto concrete at 200 knots in the dark. That skill most pilots will never have." Bennett laughed, the sound slightly hysterical, relief and exhaustion and the aftermath of adrenaline. "I need a new career. Maybe something safe like bomb disposal." Outside, firefighters surrounded the aircraft, foam guns ready but unnecessary. The engines were silent now, the threat passed. Inside the cabin, flight attendants were already opening emergency exits, deploying slides, beginning the evacuation that would clear the aircraft in less than 2 minutes. Passengers would file out into tropical air and emergency lighting, stumbling on shaky legs, some crying, others laughing, all of them alive because 3 people in a cockpit had refused to accept any other outcome. Kestrel unbuckled her harness and stood, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. Her legs felt weak, her hands trembling slightly now that the crisis had passed. Morrison stood as well, blocking the cockpit door before she could leave. "I need to know," he said quietly. "That call sign they mentioned on the radio, Graveyard, what's the story?" Kestrel considered not answering, but these men had trusted her with their lives, with the lives of everyone on board. They deserved truth. "I got that call sign because I kept bringing home dead aircraft. Fighters so damaged they should have crashed. Missions where my wingman went down and I had to finish alone. I earned that name in blood and lost friends and more sleepless nights than I can count. And I walked away because I was tired of choosing between missions and people, tired of the cost." "But you came back," Morrison said, "when we needed you, when it mattered." "Old habits," Kestrel said, attempting lightness, but they both knew it was more than that. Bennett had been listening silently. Now he spoke, his voice careful. "There's going to be an investigation, reports, media attention. They're going to want to know everything about what happened up here, about who you are." "I know." Kestrel did know. She'd been through investigations before, had sat through debriefings and after-action reports, and the endless paperwork that followed every incident. She'd hoped to leave that world behind when she resigned her commission. But some worlds didn't let you leave. They followed you, finding you in Seat 8A on a red-eye to nowhere, calling you back when physics and probability aligned against innocent people. "What I'm saying is," Bennett continued, "you're going to be famous. Hero pilot saves doomed flight. The media will love it, and I think you deserve that recognition for what you did tonight, for everyone you've saved." Kestrel started to protest, but Morrison cut her off. He's right. You spent 14 years serving in the shadows. Tonight, people get to know your name. Let them. Let them understand what real heroes look like. The cabin was nearly empty now, passengers filing out through emergency exits with practiced efficiency. Kestrel could hear children crying, adults comforting them, the murmur of survivors realizing they'd been given an unexpected gift. Outside, emergency personnel were helping people away from the aircraft, wrapping them in blankets even though the tropical air was warm, providing comfort through action if not necessity. A flight attendant appeared in the cockpit door. "Captain, we need you outside. Everyone's off except crew." Morrison nodded. "Major Vance first. She's the reason we're standing here." Kestrel wanted to argue, wanted to slip away into anonymity, but her legs were already carrying her forward. She walked through the empty cabin, seeing abandoned carry-ons and scattered magazines, the detritus of ordinary lives interrupted by extraordinary circumstances. Seat 8A sat empty, her small backpack still tucked under it. She grabbed it, slinging it over one shoulder, and continued toward the exit. The emergency slide was steep, slick. She stepped off into space and accelerated down, hitting the ground with bent knees, absorbing the impact with practiced ease. Firefighters rushed forward to help her, but she waved them off, standing on her own. The tarmac was warm under her feet, the air thick with humidity and the smell of burned rubber from the tortured tires. Emergency lights painted everything in stark relief, shadows and brilliance alternating with each strobe. A man in a fire chief's uniform approached, radio crackling at his belt. "Major Vance, I'm Chief Reyes. That was some flying." "Thank Captain Morrison and First Officer Bennett. They did the hard part. They said you guided them through it. Said without you, we'd be planning a very different operation right now." Kestrel didn't respond. What could she say? That she'd only done what training demanded, that any pilot in her position would have made the same choices. She didn't believe in false modesty, but she also didn't believe in taking sole credit for survival that required 3 people working in perfect synchronization. Passengers were being loaded onto buses, taken to the terminal where airline representatives and counselors would begin the long process of arranging alternative flights, providing support, fielding questions. Some passengers looked back at the aircraft, seeing it properly for the first time. The scorch marks from the lightning strike, the fluid streaking down the wings, the collapsed brake assemblies that had barely held together long enough to matter. They saw how close they'd come, and their faces reflected that understanding. A woman broke from the group, running back toward Kestrel. She was young, maybe 25, holding a small child who couldn't be more than 2 years old. The child was sleeping now, exhausted by crying, small face pressed against her mother's shoulder. The woman stopped a few feet away, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for my daughter's life." Kestrel felt something crack in her chest, some wall she'd built to keep emotion at bay during the crisis. She reached out, touched the child's soft hair gently. "She's beautiful. Her name is Lily, and she gets to grow up because of you." There were no words adequate to that statement. Kestrel nodded, and the woman returned to her group, glancing back twice as if to confirm Kestrel was real, that this moment had actually happened. Chief Reyes stood silently beside Kestrel, respecting the emotional weight of the encounter. "You okay, Major?" "I will be." Kestrel turned away from the passengers, toward the aircraft that sat silent on the runway. Even wounded, even broken, it looked dignified somehow. It had held together when every probability suggested it shouldn't. It had carried its human cargo to safety through a combination of engineering excellence and sheer stubborn refusal to fail. She understood that determination intimately. Morrison and Bennett emerged from the aircraft, sliding down to join them. Morrison immediately sought out Kestrel, his expression determined. "Major, I want you to know." "Don't," Kestrel interrupted. "Don't make this bigger than it needs to be. We did a job. We got lucky, that's all." "That's not all," Morrison said firmly. I've been flying for 32 years. I've seen pilots crack under pressure, seen them freeze, seen them make mistakes that cost lives. You didn't crack. You didn't freeze. You made every call correctly under impossible conditions in an aircraft you'd never flown. That's not luck. That's exceptional skill combined with experience that can't be taught. Bennett added, "You should be proud, Major. Whatever made you leave the Air Force, whatever ghosts you're carrying, tonight you proved that your training, your instincts, your courage, they matter. They saved 183 people." Kestrel looked at them both, seeing the sincerity in their faces. These were good men, professional pilots who understood the stakes, who knew how close they'd come to a very different outcome. And maybe they were right. Maybe she could allow herself this small victory, this moment where her past served a purpose beyond haunting her. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for trusting me, for listening when I asked you to do things that went against everything you'd been taught. That took courage too." An airport official approached, clipboard in hand, wearing the harried expression of someone whose quiet night had exploded into chaos. "Captain Morrison, we need statements from you and your crew. And Major Vance, the FAA will want to speak with you as well. There's there's already media gathering at the terminal. News of the emergency landing is spreading fast." Morrison glanced at Kestrel. "What do you want to do?" What did she want? To disappear, probably. To avoid the cameras and questions and inevitable attention. But Bennett's words echoed in her mind. "You're going to be famous. Let them understand what real heroes look like." She thought about the young mother and her daughter Lily. Thought about all the other passengers who would go home to families and jobs and ordinary lives because extraordinary circumstances had been met with extraordinary effort. "I'll give a statement," she said. "One statement, then I'm done." The official nodded gratefully. "We can arrange a brief press conference. Just the basics. The public deserves to know what happened, and you deserve credit for your actions." They were led to a conference room in the airport's administrative building. Someone had assembled coffee and water, the universal offerings of crisis management. Kestrel drank water, rehydrating, her body already processing the adrenaline, settling into the familiar exhaustion that followed combat operations. Because that's what the landing had been: combat operations without weapons, a battle fought against physics and mechanical failure instead of human enemies. A television in the corner showed early news coverage. Shaky cell phone footage of the landing, probably shot by someone in the terminal. The aircraft approaching fast, too fast, then the sudden violent deceleration, the smoke from burning tires, the emergency vehicles swarming. The footage cut to an anchor providing breathless commentary about miraculous saves and hero pilots. Morrison watched it with a strange expression. "That's us. That's our aircraft. Strange seeing it from outside." "Perspective," Kestrel said. "From inside we were too busy to appreciate how it looked. From outside they saw the whole picture." "Which perspective is true?" "Both, neither. Truth depends on where you're standing." The FAA investigator arrived first, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Patterson, carrying a thick briefcase and the demeanor of someone who'd spent decades picking through the wreckage of aviation disasters. He sat across from them, pulled out a digital recorder, and began the formal process of documenting what had occurred at 37,000 feet and how it had ultimately resolved at ground level. Morrison and Bennett recounted the initial lightning strike, the cascade of system failures, the desperate radio call for help. Patterson's questions were precise, technical, designed to build a timeline of events and decisions. Kestrel listened, adding details when asked, confirming technical assessments, explaining her reasoning for each recommendation. "Major Vance," Patterson said finally, "I need to understand your qualifications. You're retired Air Force, correct?" "Correct. I resigned my commission 6 months ago." "And your flight experience?" 14 years active duty, 3 combat tour, F-15E Strike Eagle platform, 273 combat missions, instructor pilot certification, Top Gun completion, Over 4,000 flight hours, roughly half in combat conditions. Patterson's eyebrows rose. Impressive. And tonight was your first time in a commercial aircraft cockpit. First time in any commercial aircraft cockpit. But flight physics are universal. The principles don't change, only the application. Still, to guide this crew through a successful landing under such circumstances, that's remarkable. Kestrel shrugged. I've landed damaged aircraft before. Sometimes you walk away, sometimes you don't. Tonight we walked away. Patterson studied her carefully. You're very calm about this. Most people who survive what you just went through would be more emotional.